welcome. I'm glad you could join us today. I have the honor and privilege of speaking with Sal Acosta. Welcome, Sal.
Thank you for having me.
You're welcome. Sal is a business broker. So, Sal, I'd like you to explain to our audience what a business broker is.
Well, very simply, we help people buy and sell businesses. Typically, since they come in all shapes and sizes, we deal in what's called Main Street businesses or lower middle market. So anything that has 10 to 250 employees, anything that has 0 to about 10 or $20 million in revenue, and anything that has, even if you maybe got a little bit derailed because of the coronavirus, but normally at least positive cash flow, break even positive cash flow, all the way to about $1 million or $2 million on the top end. So that's kind of the market where we help, again, people buy and sell businesses.
Is there any particular type of business that you tend to gravitate towards or tend to show up for you?
Well, prior to being a business broker, I had a very long career in manufacturing. So because of that, still keeping relationships in those industries, plus quite honestly, the fact that I can bring a little bit more expertise to the table than perhaps another business broker, because again, of my background in manufacturing, I tend to do a lot of activity in manufacturing. But the flip side is we don't turn anybody away. I mean, if they want to work with us, we're more than happy to work with them.
And do you have a specific demographic area that you work around, being that we are both in the greater Pittsburgh and the panhandle of West Virginia and Ohio area? So where do you tend to migrate to deal with these business sales?
Well, and that's been changing a little bit, but traditionally, it would be a 2-hour driving radius around where we are here in St. Clairsville, Ohio, which is the very eastern edge of Ohio on I-70. So that would be Pittsburgh. A lot of business comes from Pittsburgh, Wexford, Cranberry, Monroeville, Washington, Canonsburg, that whole area. And then kind of going into Ohio, Cleveland, Columbus, you start to get into the hairy edge of those 2 hours. And then as you come back around, Morgantown is about an hour and a half. So traditionally, it was anything in that 2-hour sort of driving envelope. Because me being old school, I still wanted to be able to go meet people in person, see their business, sit down with them. There was an exception a lot of times when there was a referral that was outside of that area, whether it was Florida, Texas, or somewhere else. I would work with them as long as two things happened. One is that the deal was big enough that it would justify that we were going to market it nationally. Because if the deal is big enough that we're going to market it nationally, then everybody is on an even footing. There's not really that much benefit to the client trying to get a business broker in their local community, because I've had situations where the deal is somewhere in the Southeast and the buyer could be coming, or we're coming from California or even Canada. And then two, kind of along with that, and going back to the same thing a little bit, as long as they're willing to pay, the client is willing to pay for travel expenses. Because I'm old school. I know some brokers out there, they'll let the buyer, come in on their own, and they'll let the seller kind of meet them on their own. I don't like to do that. So, again, a little bit of travel. Now, having said all that, this is now all changing because of the coronavirus. Everybody's getting more used to doing business over video chat, video conference, just trading documents via email. So I see it changing that way.
Right, exactly. Is there a type of business that you would not feel comfortable getting involved in?
Well, as long as it's something that's legal, and even that, quite honestly, with the CBD and things like that are changing. You know, as long as it's something that's legal, ethical, moral, um, I'm willing to help. The only thing is, of course, and we don't have to name particular industries, but there's some industries that are legal that the banks don't want to lend. Um, so those are I'm going to say, make the transaction a little harder, because sometimes the bank will be, let's say, even more conservative than the threshold of legal, ethical, and moral. But at least from my perspective, as long as you meet that, and again, you want to work with me, I'll work with you.
That's great. And what would you say was the parameters of your most difficult sale?
I think it's again, with unfortunately, without having to say any names,
Right.
it's when either the seller or the buyer have too much of a big ego and think the other party should give in to all of their demands. And quite honestly, sometimes some of them become a little bit unusual, let's say, or overly restrictive. So that's a little bit of you know, what makes it interesting for me, makes it challenging for me is, a lot of these folks started their business from scratch. So they've got, you know, blood, sweat, and tears poured into it. They've never had a boss to kind of tell them, you know, how things are going to go. They're very entrepreneurial, very free spirited, used to calling their shots. And unfortunately, again, sometimes that translates into a big ego and when you have two big egos coming to get it, forget it.
Yeah, that can be difficult. And what was the easiest one you ever had?
The easiest one, I think, was a combination actually of two things. One was that both the buyer and the seller were very reasonable and got along very well. I mean, it was like, to borrow an expression from you, maybe it was love at first sight. The seller loved the buyer loved the seller, and the business was priced correctly, which is also a big issue. You know, the seller was very realistic about what the business was worth, and that one flowed very, very easily because nobody was out to get anybody. You know, they were all trying to be fair to the other side and like the other side. And maybe the last element that I'll say too is, it was an industry that was very attractive. You know, there's some industries that potential business owners, the general public in general, is very attractive to. Maybe going back to your other question, there's some that they hate or they don't like or they just don't want to be involved. This one was very attractive. So really all the planets kind of aligned.
That's cool. And I had something to ask, of course it left. But have you ever, so what are the majority of circumstances that somebody decides to sell their business that you've experienced?
Well, that I've experienced, and there are some statistics and research and reports out there. But certainly the number one reason, which I consider a very good reason and a happy reason, and I like to deal with a lot, is retirement. Again, somebody started their business 10, 20, 30 years ago. A very significant portion of their wealth is tied up in the business. So before they can transition to that retirement, whether it's playing golf in Florida, hanging out with the grandkids in Pittsburgh, whatever that retirement is, they have to sell the business, cash out, to then have that capital to be able to properly retire with the lifestyle that they would like to have in retirement. So that's the predominant, and that's a happy one. Then we get into what I call kind of other special situations. Okay, so for example, somebody falls ill and can't run the business anymore. Sometimes that's correlated with age, which may be correlated with retirement, but sometimes it's not. It's a young person, relatively speaking, that for whatever reason, health-wise, can't run it anymore. We obviously have divorce where neither party wants to buy out the other one or keep running the business, whatever. So they just want to sell it to get the money and split it or do whatever it is they do. Sometimes, especially with the smaller businesses, the other spouse may have a very high level job and they're getting relocated, and obviously the spouse that's the business owner wants to go with them, and so they have they can't run the business remotely, so they have no choice but to sell it to then be able to relocate with that spouse. But again, all of these are less frequent, let's say it that way.
And do you find sometimes when there's family involved and say the owner dies and then the kids are involved, the spouse is involved, whatever, do you find those to be a little bit more difficult because there's more hands in the pot, so to speak?
Well, yes, but not only more difficult because there's more hands in the pot. What I have seen, and it's a shame, is sometimes the owner will pass away, and whether it's the kid or the spouse or whoever has no choice but to step into the breach. But historically, they have not been involved with the business. So now they're going through this horrendous learning curve, in addition to all the emotional issues with having somebody in the family pass away. And in my experience is that what that does is that creates a much more pressure to get the transaction done quickly, because quite honestly, the business is decaying. And so, hopefully you can move quick enough that you can get it sold at a good price, at a good deal, before it falls apart too much. So that's the only thing that, and then to your point, yes, if they manage to kind of keep it together, you might run into an issue of too many cooks in the kitchen, and sometimes even a divergence in personalities, or how hard they want to work, or where they want to take the business, and so you start getting into all these other things too. But again, the primary one is just make sure that you don't let it decay.
Right. Now, what about if the business also owns the property? So could the building, let's just say the building that the business is in, how does that affect the sale? And sometimes the building would be included and sometimes it wouldn't. Just to give you an example, when my father sold his dental practice, he held on to the building because he put the building up. And then, I don't know, maybe 10 years later or whatever, he decided to sell, found a buyer, and got an exceptionally great price for the building. So, tell me how a building or property would either complicate or enhance a deal.
Well, so the first thing I do, by the way, is ask them exactly that. Do you own the real estate? Yes or no? And then are you planning to sell it as part of the transaction? And so, of course, now you have, all sorts of different scenarios. And by the way, a lot of times the seller will start out thinking one way. And once he gets into negotiations with the seller, of course, the seller may have his own ideas about all this. And that transaction may end up differently. I think in general, it's good for the business to own its real estate, because the buyer is going to have to deal with less problems. I mean, they're not going to have to deal with a landlord. They're not going to have to deal with a lease that has, however much time left. Now, it does make the transaction a little bit harder in that obviously sometimes real estate is a significant component of value in the transaction. So now the purchase price goes up. The if it's a loan, the balance of the loan goes up, the payment on the loan goes up. There's more leverage, there's more debt, there's more everything. So in business, there's never a right answer. I like to say it's all pros and cons, shades of gray. What risk can you tolerate? What risk can you take? And then, by the way, you can get into, again, a little bit of shades of gray where you can, the buyer may say, hey, look, I want to rent the building at preferential terms, maybe something that's a little bit cheaper than the going market, because recognize that I'm buying this business. And they may say, oh, and by the way, I also want the right to maybe buy the business down the road at a specific price or at a specific formula or whatever the case may be. So I think owning the real estate by the seller enhances a transaction, but it can also complicate it.
Right. What about a franchise? If somebody's a franchise owner and they decide, I'm ready to retire, I want to sell this franchise. Do you handle that, or is that something like contractual that they have to go through the corporate company?
Well, that's exactly right. That's the first. Sometimes I get approached by the owner of a franchise that wants to sell for whatever reason. So you hit the nail on the head. Those are the two questions that I ask them. I ask them, first of all, okay, are you allowed to use an external advisor, business broker, or does the franchise require you to use them? And then also, by the way, sometimes a franchise will require that you only sell to somebody else in their system. And then again, quite honestly, at that point, it just doesn't even make sense almost to use a business broker, because they probably know who the other members of the network are, and they can ask, the franchise. But there's a lot of situations where they say, hey, the franchise is okay if we use an external resource, and they're okay if we sell to anybody, as long as they approve it too. And it goes back to, things that can complicate the transaction a little bit. Now you're not only dealing with, typically you'll be dealing with a landlord, because typically, when it's a franchise, they don't own their real estate. So now you're dealing with a landlord that has to give sort of the green light. You're dealing with a bank a lot of times that is giving the green light to lend the money, and now you're dealing with a franchisor that's also giving the green light for this ownership transition. So it does complicate the deal a little bit, but some franchises are out there. They call me and say, hey, Sal, we're happy you're involved, because we want a good franchisee in there, and we'll help you, we'll support you, and just go at it. And so it all depends on the mindset and the attitude of the franchisor.
Right. And how can people find you? How can they get a hold of you?
Well, the easiest way, and again, being a little bit old school, people can call me right on my cell phone. It's area code 484-358-9470. Again, 484-358-9470. Or they can email me. It's Sal, SAL459 @yahoo.com. Again, Sal459 @yahoo.com.
And we'll make sure that that's in the comments on the Facebook post. So, we'll make sure about that. This has been very informative. And, for anybody who has a box store or some sort of business where, they're getting on in years, maybe the kids are not interested in taking it over, or employees do not want to buy in order to maintain their employment there as an owner. These are times where knowing, that there are people out there like you that even if they can't work with you because of where they are demographically, maybe, getting a hold of you and you helping them in some fashion find a business broker in their area, like if they're all the way on the West Coast, that may not be feasible for you, or feasible for them to fund your travel. But, there's all kind of possibilities, even as a a second opinion to make sure that they believe that they're getting, you know, the right asking price for a business. You know, there's always reasons to talk to people in your type of work because, you know, people have questions. People want to understand. People don't want to walk into selling their business and be ignorant. You know, they want to understand the process. So, you know, you can be a
Absolutely.
great
Anybody that's
resource.
listening, just like you said, if the transaction is too small that it doesn't make sense to engage somebody geographically removed, I honestly have no problem having a conversation just to at least share with you what I think is typical and usual in these types of transactions to you know, make sure that you're not doing some type of crazy deal or crazy engagement. I mean, obviously there's different variations and you get what you pay for, but you want to make sure that at least you start from a place of reasonableness.
Right. Exactly. Is there anything else you'd like to add before we conclude the interview?
Well, the only thing that I'll mention, and it goes a little bit related to what we were just talking about, but people are always surprised. It takes a long time to sell a business, okay? You know, sometimes people think about it as, you know, like the residential real estate market, where sometimes in a particular city, the market is really hot and houses are selling in literally days and sometimes selling over asking price and things like that. The rule of thumb, and again, there's some scientific data around this, but for purposes of this short conversation, the rule of thumb is you should plan that it will take you 6 to 12 months to sell your business. So that also means that you have to start this process of talking to me or talking to somebody else at least a year before you really want to be retired. So my only sort of last piece of advice here is recognize that, don't leave it for the last minute. Talk to me, and again, I don't mind even having a conversation if you want to say, hey, listen, I'm planning because of Social Security or whatever to sell my business in 5 years. I say, fine, we'll have the conversation today. But certainly plan for at least a year before you really want that check in your checking account.
That's great advice. That's great advice. And if somebody is looking to buy a business, can they contact you?
Yes, absolutely. Same thing, same phone numbers and same email. Just call me, and I have a whole process. That could be a whole other video. Let me just say that I do have a whole process to try to figure out what would be the best business for this person to have, you know, based on their experience, the geography they're looking at, the amount of money that they want to invest. Because let's face it, not everybody's cut out for every business. You know, in terms of interest, experience, what they like to do, what they know how to do. So there's a whole process to try to figure that out, so that then we can go find an opportunity that's really going to make you happy. Because again, you're going to put a lot of blood, sweat, and tears and time into this, not to mention a lot of money, a lot of financial risk. So we want to fine tune that decision as much as possible.
Yeah, well, that's great, you know, because, you know, it's good to have somebody as a sounding board in order to help a person make the right decisions, especially when it can be such an emotional thing to sell a business. You know,
Oh, you're absolutely right. Whether
like
I'm
raising a
representing the buyer
child. Yeah.
or whether I'm representing the seller, I tell them, look, guys, forget the Rolodex, the contacts, the experience, the everything. In my mind, the biggest value I bring to the table to you is an objective pair of eyes. Okay, somebody that is not emotionally involved with this on one side or the other. Because you're absolutely right. I sometimes people make bad decisions because they let the emotions take the better of them, and you know, hopefully somebody like me can kind of steer them a little bit better in the right direction.
Right. Just like dating.
Yeah, I mean, we're kind of a matchmaker for buyers and sellers of the business. It really is like that. You have the same interpersonal issues like we were talking about. We have the same financial issues that even when it's a dating, I mean, if it gets serious, you're going to have some financial issues. So yeah, we have all the elements.
We sure do. Oh my gosh, that's funny. Well, I'm glad we were able to end this with a laugh. And audience, thank you for joining us. Sal's information will be part of this video information, and please feel free to contact him. And thank you so much for joining us. And thank you so much, Sal, for being here.
Absolutely. Thank you for the invitation.
You're welcome.